Dragon Age is dead. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Adri here with Grounded Take Gaming, and in this video, I want to talk about the most recent trailers for Dragon Age the Veilguard, as well as discuss the future of the Dragon Age franchise. Oh, and spoilers for maybe the entire Dragon Age series. You've been warned. I imagine most of the people who spontaneously clicked on this video are familiar with Dragon Age, but for those who aren't, I'll provide a little background for the sake of context. Dragon Age is a game franchise developed by BioWare Studios and developed by Electronic Arts, or EA. The first game in the series, Dragon Age Origins, was a massively successful CRPG released in 2009. It was then followed up by two sequels, Dragon Age 2, released in 2011, and Dragon Age Inquisition, released in 2014. Both sequels were marked by notable changes in both themes and combat systems, and while Origins was a breakout success, 2 and Inquisition were released to no small amount of dissatisfaction and controversy, despite their strong sales numbers. Whereas Origins was a more traditional CRPG, much in the vein of genre classics such as Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, with slower, more tactical combat systems in which players would utilize the skills and abilities of various unique party members to overcome challenges, the sequels opted for a more fast-paced, action-oriented combat system, which focused more on the control of just one party member at any given time. The art style of the first game would also be drastically changed from one of darker, simpler, more earthy, washed-out colors and environments in the first game to an increasingly more flashy, bright, and vibrantly colorful aesthetic in the sequels. This was especially true of Inquisition, which seemed to be a complete departure from the dark fantasy style that helped make the first game so successful. And this aesthetic shift also marked a change in the thematic feeling of the sequels. Whereas the story of Origins felt heavier, darker, and more grounded, Inquisition felt comparatively light, whimsical, and optimistic. And it is this clear distinction between the three games that has created so much tension and frustration in the minds of longtime fans like myself. While Inquisition may have been a wildly successful game from a sales standpoint, with it being estimated to have sold nearly twice as many copies as Origins, the subsequent dissatisfaction with the game's design and direction would ultimately undermine the legacy of the franchise. While it certainly wasn't a bad game, it exudes a decidedly more generic feel, like a project directed more by corporate focus groups and market trends, instead of true creative passion. If nothing else, Inquisition served as a harbinger of things to come. In the 5 years between the release of Origins and Inquisition, BioWare Studios experienced a mass exodus of senior and lead staff. So much so that the staff remaining to the studio at the start of Veilguard's development looked almost nothing like the original group of talented, passionate people who developed the original game and made the Dragon Age franchise so successful. In that same period, fans also began to notice more and more of what seemed to be EA's influence on development, culminating in an online multiplayer mode for Inquisition that basically nobody asked for. And this very same influence was also clearly present in both of the BioWare games released after Inquisition, namely Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem, both of which would go on to be the 2 worst-rated major game releases in BioWare's history. Suffice it to say, longtime Dragon Age fans had plenty of reason to be worried about the development of the upcoming 4th game in the series. Every game since Origins diverged from the original in mostly unwelcome ways, and the recent track record of BioWare has been utterly dismal. By and large, the Dragon Age franchise felt like it was losing the very spirit, the very essence that made it so special. But at the beginning of its development cycle, when it was known as Project Joplin, there appeared to be some hope. As reported in an article by Cameron Lucas on the gaming news site GameRant, early reporting indicated that BioWare's approach to the upcoming sequel was meant to scale down environments in contrast to Inquisition's semi-open world design, in order to facilitate the creation of content that was more hand-tailored to a single-player-centric experience. This also, of course, implied that the studio was taking player backlash at Inquisition's multiplayer mode to heart. These were all very promising details that might have eventually led to a true return to form for the franchise. But, to quote from the ever-nefarious Ramsey Bolton, if you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention. Before BioWare could bring the vision of Project Joplin to fruition, EA decided to step in and do what it always does: ruin everything you've ever loved in gaming. Project Joplin would be scrapped, and the new vision of the sequel would be renamed Project Morrison, which would see the game shift from a single-player-centric experience to a fully monetized multiplayer live service experience. That's right, they wanted to live service the hell out of Dragon Age. You know, just EA doing EA things. Now, there's no direct evidence I could find that would indicate that EA was the driving force behind this shift in design approach, but let's be real, it was EA. It's speculated that this shift occurred as a direct response to the poor critical reception of Mass Effect Andromeda, because EA looked at Andromeda's failure and instead of realizing that gamers simply dislike buggy rushed games, they concluded that the problem with Andromeda must have been that it was a single-player game, and thus Veilguard would, incidentally, be changed from a single-player-centric experience to a live service, right around the time that Anthem, another live service game from BioWare, was also in development. So it would be reasonable for us to speculate that BioWare, as a response to the failure of Andromeda, was choosing to move their entire design philosophy in the direction of live service models. Thankfully, though not for the development team, Anthem would go on to utterly flop. And it was in the wake of its failure that the Project Morrison iteration of Veilguard would be scrapped, with EA choosing to, once again, shift its development back to a single-player model. So, Veilguard's development has been troubled, to say the least, and this also explains why it's taken almost 10 years for the game to be completed. If you were hoping it was taking so long because EA had finally learned their lesson about rushing the production of their games and were choosing to instead give their development teams all the time they need to realize their vision in a highly polished, well-optimized manner, then, well, you probably haven't played enough EA games. Granted, if this shift immediately followed the release of Anthem, then that could mean the iteration of Veilguard that's releasing later this year has been in development since early 2019. That's more than the development periods of Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition combined. Plus, there's the possibility of salvageable assets from the previous two scrapped iterations that may be reusable in Veilguard's most recent form, which could have helped accelerate the development process. Although, given that one of those two previous iterations was a live service game, the possibility of reused assets could be either good or bad, and this is something we'll touch on more in a bit when we get into talking about the trailers. So, let's do that now, in fact. On June 9th of this year, as part of the Summer Game Fest Xbox Showcase, the official reveal trailer of Dragon Age The Veilguard was premiered. That same day, the trailer was also published on the official Dragon Age YouTube channel. And, ladies and gentlemen, it did not go well. As of today, the like to dislike ratio looks something like this. Let's discuss why. The trailer opens up on a bar where longtime series favorite Varric and Inquisition scout sweetheart Harding are getting themselves mixed up in a good old-fashioned bar scrap with a bunch of Power Ranger henchmen rejects. Their movements and actions are portrayed as over-exaggerated and flashy. A minor gripe on its own, I admit, but I think by putting it in the spotlight we'll begin to see a trend. As we progress forward, we're given a short introduction to a variety of new, quirky characters who will presumably act as the player character's companions. The first two, Neve, the detective, and Lucanis, the mage killer, seem just fine. They fit well enough with the spirit of the Dragon Age franchise, with a bit of a mixture of darkness and dynamic action, giving off a decidedly Inquisition feel. Not quite a return to Dragon Age's origins, but at least nothing egregiously off. But then we move on to Bellara, the Veil Jumper, and her introduction is played off as much more lighthearted and fun. The scene is bright and colorful, with Bellara herself portrayed as quirky, almost like a playful comic relief character. Which is odd, considering her entire identity is tied to the Fade, which has traditionally been portrayed as a very serious subject in the Dragon Age franchise. It is the place of dreams, magic, spirits, horrors, and demons. In the first game, it's practically a hellish prison you have to escape from without losing your very sense of self. But the feeling given off from this scene is more like a wacky, magical playground. It's a noticeable tonal shift that clashes with the foundation of what the preceding games in the series established about the Fade. And it's the first red flag that has to make a longtime Dragon Age fan wonder if the game's developer even understands the source material. From Bellara, we're introduced to Emmrich, the necromancer, and it's in his introduction sequence that I feel we should remark on Veilguard's art style. When I first saw it, the very first thing that jumped to my mind was Arcane, the animated series based on Riot Games' League of Legends franchise. I honestly feel like Emmrich could have been a character right out of Arcane's upcoming second season, and that's kind of problematic. Inquisition is the game in the series that first leaned heavily into a bright, colorful aesthetic, which was already controversial enough for Dragon Age fans, as it served as a huge departure from the darker, grittier style established by Origins, which Dragon Age 2 mostly tried to carry forward. In terms of genre, Origins, as well as the second game to some extent, were generally considered dark fantasy, which utilized an appropriately darker art style in order to set its more serious, heavy, realistic atmosphere. Yet, Veilguard, rather than returning to its dark fantasy roots, seems to be going in the opposite direction. Whereas Inquisition was bright and colorful, the presentation of Veilguard's art style is outright cartoonish, and this is a conclusion that will only be further reinforced as we continue through the trailer. Next up, we have Davrin, the Warden, and his pet Griffon, both of whom are fine. Davrin seems like your typical, serious, duty-driven warden, and his griffin is a griffin, so, cool. Although griffins are supposed to be extinct in the present Dragon Age timeline, so as much as I am excited to see griffins in the game, I really hope that the developers do their due diligence in rationalizing their sudden return. If it's done poorly or lazily, that'll serve as a clear indication of BioWare's disrespect for the franchise's lore. You shouldn't do something that'll compromise the integrity of the world-building efforts undertaken by all the developers that preceded you, just because it would be kind of cool. So we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. But the real issue in Davrin's introduction sequence is the Darkspawn, or what I have to assume are supposed to be Darkspawn. The first thing to point out is the glowing red neon lights of their eyes, their claws, and seemingly just radiating out of their skin. What's all that about? Are they infused with red lyrium? And we see Davrin slice one down, and for some reason, when the camera transitions to the horde rushing toward him, 3 or 4 other Darkspawn directly in front of him just sort of fall over for no apparent reason. Note also the way they move. Most Darkspawn in Origins generally moved similarly to humans and dwarves, though perhaps a bit more brutally to reflect their malicious nature. This served to help establish that there was a connection between these monstrous creatures and the non-blighted mortal races who opposed them. And that connection is made for a good reason. Darkspawn are born from mortal races, or more specifically, from mortal females of every race, who are forcibly transformed into Darkspawn broodmothers. Hurlocks are born from humans, Genlocks are born from dwarves, ogres are born from Kunari, and shrieks are born from elves. They are meant to be a fully sentient species of corrupted beings who directly reflect the mortal races they derive from, even having a degree of social hierarchy and intelligence, with some Darkspawn even being capable of speech. They are not meant to be a horde of mindless, ravenous zombies who just flail around awkwardly. The Darkspawn in this trailer look like they'd be called generic Call of Duty zombie model number 3 or something. And let's talk about the real elephant in the room. What the hell is this guy supposed to be? Is that an ogre? Is that supposed to be an ogre? I mean, he's the big, brutish, heavy Darkspawn of the group, which is exactly the role that ogres filled in the older versions of the franchise. But look at him. Look at him with his big, stupid, googly eyes. I mean, at least the weird glowing red eyes on the smaller ones can look kinda cool, even if they're generic and out of place, but this big guy just looks like a goofy idiot. Plus, look at those perfect teeth. Those are some nice chompers. Apparently being part of a Darkspawn horde comes with excellent dental care. The Kooslins are literally dying to have teeth like those. It honestly feels like the design of the Darkspawn has grown progressively more generic and mediocre with every sequel Bioware releases. I mean, how did we go from this to this? This big, dumb, stupid idiot. The Darkspawn were once the primary threat in the Dragon Age games, so to see them relegated to generic zombie spawns, and the likes of which you'd see in just about every live service zombie shooter on the market, is truly sad. I understand that they're not meant to be a primary focus of this sequel, but at a bare minimum, treat their design with the degree of respect they deserve. After all, without this, you would never have had this. Let's move on to the next companion, Taash, or Taash. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced. The Dragon Hunter. She seems cool, I guess. That's honestly all I've got. She appears to be a generic, badass Kunari warrior fighting a dragon, which is, fine. Generic, but fine. Then we're taken back to Varric and Hardin's conversation brawl, with Varric wondering wherever will they find someone legendary enough to lead a party of veteran badasses on a mission to save the entire world. To which Hardin's like, hey, how about that rando back there who seems pretty good in a bar fight? Yup, that's a thing. But I'm gonna give it a pass, because it's not even close to the most contrived setup for a video game plot that I've consciously chosen to overlook. And it remains to be seen if such a setup is even how events will actually transpire in-game, or if it's simply done here for theatrical effect in the trailer. Finally, we're transported to a battleground in which the main character and their new companions are slaughtering endless waves of Darkspawn before a massive dragon shows up to join the fight. It's an alright scene, I suppose, once again showcasing the bright and colorful art design of Veilguard. Also notice the Darkspawn's awkward flailing movements are back yet again. They look kind of like the least athletic kid in class when they're forced to run laps because the boomer gym teacher doesn't believe in doctor's notes. Overall, I think this ending sequence was designed as an homage to the Dragon Age Origins Sacred Ashes trailer that was part of the first game's original marketing campaign. The setup is clearly similar, with the presumed player character and their companions slaughtering endless waves of Darkspawn before a massive dragon shows up to join the fight. Sound familiar? Although, it's a weird comparison for Veilguard's developers to intentionally highlight, considering it serves to establish the distinction between the original game and what the franchise has since become. And in at least the eyes of longtime fans of the series, I don't think Veilguard comes out looking the better. And so the trailer concludes with a dramatic reveal of the game's new title, more on that in a second, as well as an unspecific release date slated for sometime this fall, so not too far off, for better or worse. Now, about that new title for the game, as most people who've been periodically monitoring the game's development progress for the last 10 years will know, the game wasn't originally titled The Veilguard. This was a change announced just as of the premiere of this reveal trailer, so very recently. Prior to this, the game was expected to be titled Dragon Age Dreadwolf, which I think we can all agree is much cooler than The Veilguard. But BioWare's reason for the change was fairly reasonable. They decided that it would be more appropriate for the game's title to focus more on the player character instead of the story's antagonist. Dreadwolf refers to Solas, the character who is believed to be the game's primary villain. Aside from being good reasoning, there's also a degree of historical consistency with the titles of the previous games. Of the two previous games that actually use a word as their subtext, I'm looking at you, Dragon Age 2. Both use a term that refers to the player character in some sense. The Origins in Dragon Age Origins refers to the multiple diverse background stories that you can play through depending on your choice of race and sometimes class. The Inquisition in Dragon Age Inquisition refers to the organization that the player character ends up leading over the course of the game, taking on the moniker of Inquisitor, which is also the word most often used to refer to the player character by NPCs in the game. So, as much as Dreadwolf is an objectively cooler name, the choice to change it to something more player-centric was for the best, especially since it was more recently revealed that Solas, the Dreadwolf, isn't even the primary villain. However, as much as it was the right decision to change the name, the one that was chosen is still worth scrutinizing a bit. While the word Veilguard may be a generally appropriate, if not generic, description of what the player character's group will stand for, the decision to add the simple article "the" before it was not very well considered. While the difference between Dragon Age Veilguard and Dragon Age The Veilguard may not seem significant, consider for a moment the pattern established by the Dragon Age brand. Every game prior to now, yes, even you, Dragon Age 2, used a single word as the subtext to its title. Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age 2, Dragon Age Inquisition, though admittedly that last one's quite a mouthful. This pattern, as is common in the industry, establishes a sense of continuity in its naming conventions, and this continuity invariably becomes part of the franchise's brand. Players of long-running series expect, sometimes even subconsciously, for each new game in their favorite franchises to follow the same established naming conventions. The degree of familiarity and comfort that such conventions convey in the minds of consumers is a massively beneficial and lucrative asset to any game developer. The only reasons I can think of as to why the developer of a long-running franchise would choose to disregard their long-established naming conventions is either they did so knowingly in order to break with said established convention and usher in a new era for the franchise, or simply because the person or people with the final say don't understand or care about the franchise enough to bother following such conventions, and instead just choose whatever arbitrarily sounds best to them. Granted, all we can do is speculate about BioWare's choice to break with their own naming conventions, but regardless of the reason, we can generally conclude that whatever led up to the decision bodes poorly for the future of the Dragon Age franchise. With the reveal trailer out of the way, we can now move on to the gameplay trailer, which premiered on June 11th, just 2 days after the first. And if you're wondering whether the release of gameplay footage did anything to help improve community reception to the game, well, I mean, it definitely is an improvement, though it's objectively not good. Now, I'll just state right away that while this trailer is much longer than the first, about 10 times longer in fact, I won't actually be spending much more time talking about it, as much of the criticism I have is just a reiteration of what was said about the first trailer. So, the trailer opens up on the magical city of Minrathous, the great capital of the Tevinter Imperium. Varric and the main character, nicknamed Rook, are on the hunt for Solas, hoping to stop him before he tears down the Veil, which is the magical barrier that separates the physical world from the spiritual world, known as the Fade. Merging the physical and spiritual worlds would release countless spirits, including demons, into the realm of mortals, which is obviously a problem. One of the first notable elements of the opening sequence is the incredibly gorgeous graphical fidelity. The game looks absolutely beautiful. However, it's important to remember that this is just a trailer that isn't necessarily representative of the final game. So take all the beautiful eye candy you see with a nice healthy grain of salt. While the graphics are undoubtedly beautiful, there's a few gripes to point out right at the beginning. The first is the persistence of the bright, colorful, cartoony graphics that we saw in the first trailer, which serves as confirmation that this aesthetic, which I and I'm sure many other fans find concerning, is in fact representative of what we'll be getting in the final game. Although, I'm not necessarily getting those arcane vibes anymore. Now, it's mostly generic Fortnite Star Wars vibes. Yes, Star Wars. Just take a look at the neon signs in that opening section and the giant floating spotlight base in the sky. Try telling me that that doesn't look like it could be a scene right out of Jedi Fallen Order or Jedi Survivor, which is a media franchise with a very different thematic feel from Dragon Age. I don't know if these neon signs are supposed to be magical or specially made from lyrium, but they are a far cry from anything seen in any other major city thus far depicted in the Dragon Age franchise, so much so that it looks like a Disney crossover. Hell, there's even a moment that sounds like a TIE fighter is flying by. Oh crap indeed, Varric. Oh crap indeed. Now, don't get me wrong, Minrathous is supposed to be a place of wondrous magical ingenuity. That has long been established in the lore, but there's a way to do it that's faithful to a dark fantasy world. Instead, BioWare chose Disney World. Moving forward, Rook and Varric meet up with Harding, and it's here that we get our first glimpse of combat. Some notable features are a reactive dodge indicator above the player character's head, hybrid-style class combat with a rogue capable of using both daggers and bow weapons in a single build, heavy emphasis on basic attacks, high combat mobility, and much like in Inquisition, limited healing consumables that are replenishable by discovering lootable stashes located across the map. So clearly, the game has leaned more heavily in the direction of action-oriented combat, and that's fine. Personally, I'd prefer to see a return to the old CRPG tactics-oriented style of combat, but whatever BioWare chooses, whether action or tactical, I'd prefer that they fully lean into their choice. Trying to create a hybrid-type system that pleases both old fans and corporate suits alike has only produced mediocre results in the past. As the group continues on, they engage yet more enemies, and we get a glimpse of a parry mechanic that can deflect projectiles back at foes. Also of note is an automatic loot mechanic at the end of the battle, which is a complete departure from the manual looting system of all past games. Given that this is certain to be a faster-paced game that'll likely pit players against large waves of enemies, this might be for the best. But such a system will diminish the weighty value of items that traditionally had to be manually collected by the player. I just know that I would loot something really special at some point and not even notice while I'm caught up in the flow of combat. Ultimately, this change is for the best, but it's not without some sense of loss. In the next fight, we get a look at abilities and what looks like some sort of action point system. Abilities must be used from an extensive pause menu, which is an odd choice that will no doubt disrupt the fast-paced flow of combat. Abilities also require what seems to be action points that are built up by landing basic attacks, and taking damage seems to reduce action point progress. But bear in mind that this is all shown from the perspective of the rogue style class, so it's entirely possible that mechanics will differ for warriors and mages. With those enemies disposed of, the group meets up with Neve, and this is a good time to remark on the dialogue selection system. It's a scroll wheel. Again, just like Inquisition, but it looks fancier this time. Much has been said about the scroll wheel dialogue system in narrative-heavy games, so I won't go too deep into it, but suffice it to say that being given a short summary that's meant to convey the general meaning of each dialogue choice comes with its own problems. What you select doesn't always play out in dialogue the way you imagine, which can create a serious disconnect between the player and their in-game character. I was hoping that Baldur's Gate 3's successful use of a silent protagonist, paired with dialogue options that are displayed in full, which is the same system used in Origins, would inspire BioWare to return to their roots, but it clearly didn't. I guess Baldur's Gate 3 didn't fully release until Veilguard was already nearing the late stages of development, voice recordings likely included, so perhaps there was never any hope of that. After speaking with Neve, the group finds Solas in Minrathous, and then pursue him through his magical portal that transports them to Arlathan Forest. All of that occurs off-screen. Once in Arlathan Forest, they fight off another group of wraiths, and eventually encounter a pride demon. And let me just say outright, that's not a pride demon. It's definitely not my pride demon. Hashtag not my pride demon. It's time for us to talk about enemy model design. Let's go back to the wraiths. One thing you're likely to have noticed by now is almost every demon we've seen so far looks like it just came back from a rave with all the neon coming out of every nook, cranny, and orifice of its body. So what's with all this glowy crap? Remember how the Darkspawn in the previous trailer also had glowing red hands and eyes? Well, aside from old googly eyes, of course. Earlier I speculated that maybe the Darkspawn were infused with red lyrium, and while that's still very much a possibility, I think there's a far more practical reason for why most enemies are designed to shine. Back in Origins, the names of enemies would appear in a nameplate above their heads, along with a health bar. These names would clearly indicate what kind of enemy you were dealing with, including if they were a special type like a Genlock emissary instead of just a basic Genlock. Additionally, enemy names would be displayed in a different color depending on their rank, white for common, yellow for elite, and orange for boss. With this clearly outlined color coding system, along with readily displayed enemy names, a generally slower combat system, and the ability to pause frequently for tactical purposes, it was very easy for a player to understand their situation on the battlefield. So, what happens when you make your combat system faster, with less practical opportunities for tactical gameplay? Well, you suddenly don't have time to read nameplates. In fact, the only time you seem to be able to read an enemy's name designation at all in Veilguard is when you pause the game to enter the ability selection menu, or when you're facing a boss enemy whose nameplate appears on your screen throughout the entire fight. So, how do you tell enemies apart when you're zipping around the battlefield surrounded by colorful particle effects? Well, you give them their own distinctive particle effects. So when you're flying around with all your fast mobility and things start getting chaotic, you'll still always be able to make out enemy positions by their distinct glowing blob. The color of their neon hue could also help distinguish enemies by type, rank, and abilities, making it easier for the player to plan around their strengths and weaknesses through easily recognizable visual cues. Notice also that many enemy weapons, from claws to swords to staves, likewise have a glowing effect of their own. This is to make it easier, along with the reactive dodge indicator, for the player to see and avoid attacks. So it has a practical purpose. Does that make it acceptable? No. No, it doesn't. I mean, if this were Fortnite or generic live service looter shooter number 3652, then sure, why not? But it's not any of those things. It's Dragon Age, and it's sad that this is what has become of the franchise. To be clear, glowy particle effects are not necessary in all fast-paced action games. Just look at Elden Ring as a perfect example. If you design your game so that enemy movements and attacks are clearly visible to the player character without their vision being obscured by a symphony of particle effects, then you won't need to incorporate copious amounts of neon lights to enemy model designs. Make no mistake, what we're seeing in Veilguard's combat system thus far is not a result of necessity, but of choice. And the most egregious offense we see in this gameplay trailer is no doubt the Pride Demon. For reference's sake, here's what a Pride Demon should look like. The deviation from the original design is clear and blatant, but the question is why? Did someone at BioWare just think they could do better? This rendition of the Pride Demon is like something straight out of Kingdom Hearts. As a successor to the Dragon Age franchise, it's out of place and disappointing. Let's wrap things up with this trailer. After the Pride Demon Heartless boss is dead, the team moves in to stop Solas' ritual to tear open the veil. They fail, and Varric's trusty crossbow Bianca is destroyed, which is honestly a sadder death scene than if Varric had been the one to die. I'm just gonna say, hot take incoming, I think Varric is an overrated character. The games keep telling me he's a cool character, but I can't recall him ever doing a single thing to actually deserve his reputation. I generally like him, but he's nothing special in my mind. So yeah, I just had to get that off my chest. And to be clear, I definitely don't want him to die, though I think he probably will. I simply had a stronger reaction to Bianca's death than I would for Varric's. She was a damn fine crossbow. So Solas succeeds in tearing open the veil, despite the team's best efforts to stop him, and two scary-looking figures can be seen just on the other side. The end. So what can we take from this ending? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's been confirmed that Solas is not the main antagonist, which is great, because he sucks. I could honestly rant for far too long about how bland and uninteresting of a character Solas is. I thought the revelation about his identity in Inquisition was underwhelming and contrived. Frankly, I just didn't care. The thought of him being the main baddie in Veilguard would have been a massive loss in my mind. So, thankfully, that's not an issue, as we'll be getting two other, never-before-seen villains to contend with. Here's hoping they don't suck. Well, that's the two trailers covered, so what's the big takeaway? The art style is cartoony, the aesthetics are out of place, the enemies look either goofy or disappointing, the dialogue wheel has been brought back, and Bianca is dead. Not exactly a very promising outlook, is it? At least not for longtime fans. And that brings me back to my first point in the video. Dragon Age is dead. What I really mean when I say this is that the spirit of the Dragon Age franchise established by the first game is no longer present in the values and decisions of the very studio who created it. For so long, fans of the original game have held out hope that BioWare would eventually come to their senses and return the game to its roots. But I think if the history of every Dragon Age sequel has taught us anything, it's that the BioWare of today doesn't care, because the BioWare of today is now a completely different company with completely different priorities. And under these conditions, with the intellectual property rights of the franchise firmly in the developer's control, we are likely to never again see another game in the franchise with the same level of depth, character, or narrative weight as we had in Dragon Age Origins. They don't get it because they don't want to. Will Veilguard have any chance at being as incredible of a game as Origins? Almost certainly not. Does that mean it'll be a bad game? No, it doesn't. If it's likely to resemble any of the other games in the franchise, it'll be Inquisition. And Inquisition, despite its many flaws and as much as it was disappointing for many, was still a pretty good game. Just the same, Veilguard may yet also turn out to be a pretty good game. Maybe even a great game, in its own way. But it'll never truly be a Dragon Age game. At least, not in the eyes of the fans that have loved the franchise since its inception, who are now left with only memories of what it once was, and bitter dreams of what it could have been. If you're planning to protest this game because of BioWare's neglect and disregard for the franchise's history, I think you're more than justified in doing so. And if you're willing to give it a try, then I think you'll be able to enjoy it far more if you aren't holding it to a standard that it has no interest in meeting. But you should, of course, wait for some trusted reviews before making any decisions. And for those of us still holding out hope that BioWare will one day do justice to the memory of Origins, what I say to you is keep fighting the good fight, stay true to your values, and never stop caring. But for this one franchise we all love so deeply, it is truly now time to let go. We can at least take solace in the thought that the same spirit which drove the development team that laid the foundation of the Dragon Age franchise is still carried on in the efforts of so many other contemporary developers, like Larian Studios in their work on Baldur's Gate 3. The essence of what made Origins such an amazing, memorable, unifying experience still lives on today. That won't change because a single, once great studio has fallen to greed and mediocrity. The true legacy of the Dragon Age franchise will continue on so long as those of us who so deeply cared for it, gamers and developers alike, choose to remember its spirit. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. It's been a while since my last, which was also my first. Much has changed since then. I have a new mic, a new computer, and even here in a few months, a new job. So the time feels right to start getting serious about content creation on this channel. Expect new videos to start coming out more frequently from here on out. I was gonna do a review, or maybe a first impression video of The First Descendant, but that's been off to a rough start, so I scrapped that idea and decided to finish this one instead. If you have any thoughts on the video, feel free to leave a comment. If you liked the video, please feel free to leave a like. If you disliked it, feel free to leave a dislike. And if you'd like to see all my future content, then please feel free to subscribe. It's greatly appreciated. Thanks again for joining me. This has been Adri with Granite Gaming. Just as a friendly reminder, don't pre-order video games, and I hope to see you again next time.